I'm Douglas Thomas, born October 19th, 1920 in Trigg County. I'm married to Louise Thomas, and we have two children. Richard Thomas is married to Marilyn Tolles, and they live in Frankfort, Kentucky. And Dorinda Thomas, who's married to Danny Scholler, they live in Trigg County, and they have our only two grandchildren, David and Kerry. And I am going to, speaking from a father, and tell you a little bit about his life. He was son of Francis Miriam Thomas, better known as Frank Thomas. And it was told back when Frank Thomas got ready to leave home, in those days their father gave him so much land. And according to the amount they gave him was the son that stayed at home the longest would get a little more than the ones that left earlier. And he gave him a grandfather, this land just went out through the woods marking off a line, and deeded him so much, in which he built a 20 by 20 log cabin on and lived as a bachelor for a good while. And it was said one day that there was a Mrs. Rogers and her daughter, which was a small baby, came to visit my grandfather. And said that evening when they got on the mother got on the horse to leave, why, my grandfather handed her the baby, and she thanked him, and he said, well, I'll just charge you this daughter whenever she gets old enough to marry. And so it was said when she got 16 years old that my grandfather and her married. He was 37 at that time. And to this union there were 14 children born. There was 4 of them which died in small childhood, but there was 10 that lived to be grown. My dad was the 12th child of this 14, and he was recognized at the Thomas Bridges Association as being the oldest Thomas man. And he is 81 years old at this time. Of course, he's had a stroke and is making his home in a rest home. Going back to my grandfather, Frank Thomas, his father was Starkey Thomas, and Stark's father was James Thomas. James Thomas came from Carolina and settled on Dollison Creek in Trigg County. And that was when my great-grandfather, Stark Thomas, was about 6 years old. And my grandfather's family, of the 14 children, there were 14 grandchildren and 22 great-grandchildren and 14 great-great-grandchildren. And I'll just tell you a few things that I heard my dad say when they were boys, growing up, of things that would happen. He said back in those days, lots of people would visit, and sometimes they would even come of the morning early, and you would ask them in for breakfast, and they'd come in and eat breakfast with you. And he said one time there was a neighbor came in, and they invited him in to eat breakfast, and so he accepted. And so my grandfather asked him would he ask a blessing. And so he was a fellow that was kind of slow speech and talked long, and just as he started off slowly asking the blessing, my uncle was sitting on a little box eating, so it kind of tickled him, as lots of boys, probably 7 or 8 years old, would be. And so my grandfather started to kick him on the leg so he'd be quiet. And when he did, why, he knocked the box out from under him and he fell in the floor. And Dad said then a lot of nights when they were boys sitting around the fire in the wintertime, of course, they would all sleep upstairs. And they'd all get ready to go to bed, but pull off their shoes and get just ready to run because it'd be cold and didn't want to stay away from that fire too long. And said maybe one of them would sit there and go to sleep, and all of a sudden one of the boys would get up and flop them on the lips and wake them up. So they didn't like that too well. And like boys will be, he said one night that one of the boys got up and flopped the other one's lip and took off for the stair steps. And happened this boy had a hatchet laying close to him, and he threw that hatchet, and today you can see the mark of where the hatchet hit the stairway, and there's still a sign of it there right now. Dad said one time him and his brother Stark was left at home all day, and they decided about dinner time they'd like to have them some rice to eat. So they went and got the stove fire going, and they dipped them out as much rice as they thought they could eat. And so they poured that in the pan. Of course, as it got cooking real good, the rice got to swelling and filled the pan up. Well, they'd go get them another pan. Of course, the same thing would happen, and I think they had to get about 3 pans before they ever got through, and then they had so much rice they had to throw part of it away. They couldn't eat all of it. But Dad said there was one thing, they'd have a lot of fun and a lot of eating, but there's always understood of a morning they might go to the table to eat breakfast, but there wasn't any breakfast to be eaten until their father come in from feeding. Of course, the boys had to help feed too, but it didn't matter who got to the house first. They'd always have to wait until their dad got there for breakfast.
I'm Louise Thomas, the daughter of Hugh and Georgie Boyd Thomas. I married into this family.
No, wait, I did something on here.
My father-in-law got to be Papa. At first, I just called him Cousin Jimmy because Douglas and I have the same roots that go back to this same old Mr. James Thomas. And it just was automatic that I called my in-laws cousin. Thought nothing about it. Everybody else did too, because in this vicinity everybody has married his cousins. So it didn't matter until Douglas's sister Gertrude married a Hoosier. Now Herbert didn't know anything about all of these kinfolks, and at first he referred to his in-laws as Gertrude's mother or Gertrude's dad. And finally one day he brought the house down when he began to call his mother-in-law Cousin Lucy. He still didn't understand, and when everybody laughed he didn't understand any better, and I doubt that he ever really accepted it. But that was taken care of a few years later when their little girl began to talk, and she began to say Papa. And of course she was trying to say grandfather, or grandpa probably, and that finally settled down to Papa. And Herbert and I both had a way out. We didn't have to call our in-laws cousin anymore. We just say Papa.
I'm living on part of my grandfather's farm, and when he died, why there were 6 of the boys that were living, and 2 of the girls was living at that time, and of course they divided up his land between them. And now, at this time I've got one part where my aunt died, and I bought it. And of course the boys always lived here, right, joining farms and working together. And I'd listen to them talk about things that happened back when they were boys. They'd always get laughing about something that happened. And so they told on my Uncle Haywood back when he was courting. One night, him and his girlfriend had been to a party, and they were coming home, and they turned the buggy over with them. And so he come in telling the boys about it, and they would tell him, oh, it didn't happen like that. And of course he'd tell them it did. And so the next morning, he got 2 or 3 of them, and just nothing would do him but for them to get out there in front of the house and cut the shafts of the buggy around and turn it over, just like it happened the night before. He told them just exactly how to do it. And of course they'd still get the kick out of that after they got older. And then they told another tale on my Uncle Haywood, which was true. Said one night he is going rabbit hunting. Said there's big snow on the ground, the moon was shining bright, and so he decided he'd go out and kill him some rabbits. And so he got out in the field right by where I live now, and he saw a rabbit sitting out there. So he took good aim on this rabbit and shot him, and when he went over to pick it up, he thought he was really going to have him some good meat to eat. But got over there to pick it up, and it wasn't nothing but a stump what he had shot. And they were always pulling tricks on each other and having fun. I could hear them talk about it. Of one of my aunts that I've just heard my dad talk about a lot, of course he was small when she died. She was married, and they had a home, the wedding at home, and they said there was a big snow on the ground and people had to walk to come to the wedding. And of course at that she had what the people called a pretty big wedding at that time, and but she didn't live but about 5 months after the wedding, and they kept her wedding clothes for years and years after that. And she married a brother, Cunningham. Of course, I never did know my aunt. She died several years before I was born, but I do remember her husband. In his later years, he was in a wheelchair. And of course, I was a boy, something like 4 or 5 years old, and I can remember very well of him coming to my granddad's. And of course, back then, people didn't use trucks like we do now, and so they was going to carry him up to my uncle's one morning, and they got them using wagon and put him in this, had him in this rolling chair and rolled him in the wagon, and we were going on up the road. And of course, as a boy, we passed the hog pen, and I told him, I said, let's just throw Uncle Earl over at the hogs. I said, he's no count, no how. And of course, he had a big laugh over that. And then one of my uncles that I never did know, he was deputy sheriff at the time he took typhoid fever and died. And he was the sheriff that he rode with, and lots of times said he didn't want to go with this sheriff, because he said that every time when they'd go to arrest somebody, why, the sheriff would pull his gun, and said he didn't like to use no gun. And of course, Uncle Harvey was aiming to run for sheriff the next year, but he took typhoid fever and died.
But I'm Louise Thomas. I have spoken already. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my family. My father, I told you his name was Hugh, and he was the son of Robert and Emma Cunningham Thomas. My father was married to my mother in 1910. She was Georgie Boyd. He was 2 days, like 2 days being 20, and she was just past her 70th birthday. They had lived at Blue Spring, just a stone's throw from what is now Bartley Lodge. Mother and Dad lived here in this county, and they saw their 4 children born in Trigg County, all girls. My oldest sister was a premature baby, and she was said to be the smallest baby anybody ever saw to live. And it was real comical, almost, the many things that they made do with in 1911, when there were no hospitals, no bassinets, and anything to take care of a premature baby. My grandmother fed her with a teaspoon. She made her own formula. She soaked a biscuit in warm water, added a touch of sugar, and fed her a drop or 2 at the time, every 2 hours, day and night, for 6 weeks. Finally, at 6 weeks, they decided that she might live, and everybody had talked about her weight, and the men had discussed and bet over it how much she would weigh. So they weighed her, and she weighed 2.5 pounds. 6 weeks old, fully clothed, in a dress that was long enough to double back over her face twice, and 2.5 pounds. Mother and Dad had 4 girls, and then they moved to Christian County, and there they had 4 more girls. I was the first one who was born in Christian County. It must have been hard for my parents. Of course, I was born in 1920, so that was years of depression by the time I was getting into school. A big family on a big farm during a big depression. And it must have been terribly hard, but we didn't know it. I guess we were just a little bit ignorant, we children. Mother was born 6 months after her father died, and she learned conservation from the time she was born. She was the fifth child, and she knew how to make do and do without. So we didn't really realize we had plenty to eat and plenty to wear, and if Mother sewed on a few more patches, what child would notice? We lived on this big farm in Trigg County, and help was easy to get. I've seen my dad write checks, many checks at the end of every week. $1.50 to a man who had worked 6 days from sunup to sundown, 25 cents a day. And he always had plenty of help. They cut bushes, they sawed wood. There's just no telling of the amount of work that people did. And it was funny, odd, I guess, years later, as I looked at those checks, and there was Wilson Ware, and I remembered him as a big husky black man, $1.50, 6 days work. And there were so many like that. Of course, we lived on this 999-acre farm that had belonged to the McCarty family. Mr. Ed McCarty had been born there, as had his sister, Mrs. Dan Grinner. When my parents were first married, there weren't any stores for their furnishings, and so pretty soon along came a drummer selling cook stoves. The Majestic range. They were beautiful old cast iron things, large contraption with a warming oven over the top and a 15-gallon reservoir for water on the side. They were something. And this drummer did his selling pretty good, and when he left the Blue Spring community, there was maybe 3 or 4, maybe half a dozen women who were the proud owner of the Majestic range. But it surely did set Blue Spring on its ear, because those wives whose husbands refused for one reason or another to buy a new cook stove, they said they'd eat burned biscuits until they actually began almost to like them, and their beds in the hayloft got pretty hard. In about a year, that same drummer came back, and this time he was selling sewing machines, and he made a killing. Those husbands remember those beds in the hayloft, and every husband who had refused to buy the cook stove bought sewing machines. He made a killing, and the farmers around there began to put their heads together and threatened to throw that drummer in the river if he came back again selling anything.
To my dad, Jimmy Thomas, he is better known by Jimmy Faint Thomas. Where he got the Faint was from his father. His father was always called Faint. And how come start calling Dad Jimmy Faint was for the reason on the mail route there were about 3 other Jimmy Thomases, and they couldn't keep the mail straight. They were always getting their mail tangled up, so everybody just got to, if they was wanting to write to my dad, well, they'd put Jimmy Faint Thomas, and he's gone with that ever since. And Dad used to say that they'd always pulling tricks on their mother. They would go to the door and knock on the door, and of course she would find out who it was, and she'd holler and tell them, well, come in if your nose is clean, because that was a saying that was said around the lot. So one night there's someone knocking on the door, and so my grandmother hollered, come in if your nose is clean, expecting one of the boys to come running in, and it happened to be a traveling salesman. Back at that, and of course he opened the door and came in, and back at that time you was always having salesmen coming through the country, and so of course Dad and them always raised tobacco, and that night they were talking about farming, raising tobacco, and of course the salesman was wanting to kind of impress me a lot, and he said, yeah, he knew a whole lot about raising tobacco. And of course anybody that's familiar with tobacco knows that back in those days, why, we didn't have all this chemicals that we use now to kill the suckers and worms on tobacco. You had to break the suckers out and catch those worms and kill them. And so this salesman said that night, said, yeah, I know all about raising tobacco. Said, I've worked in it. Said, I know just exactly how to break those worms and catch them suckers. And of course the man had never worked in any tobacco in his life, I don't imagine, but he was trying to make a good impression on them.
Depression, my parents were sending 7 children to school. My mother made all of our clothes, except our shoes, of course. Now, clothes were something that you could hand down from one child to the next with a hem taken up or let down and a patch sewed on. But shoes were something else. When we bought our shoes, they were bought big enough that you could wear them out before you outgrew them. You could stick your finger down through the back or through the toe, but they were bought large enough that you did not outgrow them. When we went to school, there were 2 buggies. There were 7 of us in school. We could go in one buggy. But by the time I was in the 2nd grade, my older sisters were ready for high school. So 2 went to high school at Newstead in one buggy, and Rosie, May, and I went to Walnut Grove in the other buggy. We had lots of trouble. The horses would run away occasionally. Even little old Daisy, that was so lazy she couldn't get one foot in front of the other once in a while, would run away. There was a time when we got stuck in the ice. It was awful cold. The thermometer was in the single figures, and when we got to the place where the sinkholes had overflowed the road, the ice was so thick that Daisy couldn't break through it. And Edna jumped out into that water and held that horse there in freezing sub-zero temperature while Pearl ran back to school to get some of the boys to get us out of the ice. There were many hilarious things. I imagine my mother didn't think they were very hilarious. I wonder sometimes that she didn't have more gray hairs. Sending 7 children to school, keeping all of their clothes clean, and on the side cooking for from 8 to 20 hands, depending on what they were doing. Our dining room table seated 10, and one in the kitchen seated 8, and both of them were always full. And my mother did all of the cooking. Once in a while she would have some good old soul of the niggers to help her. Aunt Mary Jane was our black nanny. She always seemed to know when Mother needed her the most. I don't know how, but you could look across the field and Aunt Mary Jane would be coming in a slow trot. Aunt Mary Jane almost starved to death during the Depression. Everybody was so busy with themselves that Mother kept saying, you know, we ought to go over tomorrow and see how old Aunt Mary Jane's doing. But the winter was cold and it was hard enough to do for ourselves. On a day in the early spring, Aunt Mary Jane made it across the footlog to our house. She was so thin that you could tell even from a distance that she'd been sick. But when she came in, she said, "No, Miss Georgie, I ain't sick. I's hungry, honey."
I've heard my dad talk about taking a few trips to his grandmother Rogers, who lived over close to Lennon. That's a community about something like 10 miles from where we live. And he said as just a small kid he was going over there with one of his cousins that was quite a bit older than he was, had hitched up the horse and mule to the wagon, and I don't know, I guess probably my dad and his mother, and I don't know just how many of them were along, but a good many. And Dad said he was going along, they were, and said this old horse and mule sort of put their nose together, and said that Dad said something about it, and this older man, his cousin, who was Jim Thomas, said, "Well, they're talking to each other." Said, "And you know, mules and horses talk to each other." Said, "Now," said, "I don't know just what they're saying, but," said, "each one of them knows what the other one's saying," and said, "That's the way they talk to each other." So Dad said they go on over there and stay all night, and so the next morning when they get up, Grandmother gets ready to cook breakfast, and they have a black man that works with them all the time. Said she'll call him out and tell him, "Sam," said, "go out there and shoot me so many chickens for breakfast this morning." He said the chickens would roost up in trees, and this old black man would get out there and kill them, their meat for breakfast. And still living in the Oak Grove Church community. The church is one that my great-grandfather Stark Thomas helped establish, and of course his ancestors on down through the years have been members of the church. My grandfather at one time was a treasurer of the church. And I can remember mighty well one year before my grandfather died that was having a Little River Association at the Old Grove Church. And I know my dad and I took a 24 Model T Ford and went to Lennon and got a black man and 2 women to come over and help cook. Back at those days, they'd have an association for 2 or 3 days and have furnished dinner for the people. And I can remember very well that them coming and helping cook hams and dress sheep, fix sheep, and they would take an extra wagon to just carry the food to the association. And back at that time, there were people would come from all over the county. It wasn't just a few of the churches. It was everybody for miles around would come, and a lot of them would just come for dinner, and that would be all. They wouldn't even stay for the service. Of course, most of the people would stay for service.
During the Depression, it was hard for both the hired man and the farm owner to make a living. And my dad, who worked so many black and white people, set up the store in our fur room. In a family where there are a lot of children, you just get some funny words to come out sometime. And Mother referred to the room that was across the hall as the fire room, and to us it became the fur room. And that's where Dad kept store. In that room there was already 2 double beds where my 4 older sisters slept, and right at the foot of one of the beds was Dad's big desk, and on and around that desk was the store. He would get from the wholesale house in Hopkinsville bags and boxes of staples, and at the end of every week the man who lived on the farm and had a family, besides the $1.50, he got food stuff. There would be a slab of bacon or a package of beans, some potatoes that usually came from our kiln out of the garden, and a big keg of soda. Anything that a hired man might need, even down to the cornmeal that Dad ground himself. We'd help him shell the corn, and he'd grind the meal, and that was the staples for the black families. They would come into our fur room on payday, and Dad would sit at the desk and write out his check, and then he'd cut a big slab of meat. A slab, the size of the slab would depend on the size of the family. And from the back of the smokehouse there was always a big barrel of salt and molasses, and the best hands got a bonus, a jug of molasses. Mother would give them milk sometimes, and she would lend them everything. They'd come borrowing, and they'd always say, "Pay you Sandy." Well, the $1.50 that they got didn't cover what they had to have, let alone paying for all the things that they borrowed through the week. They borrowed a few eggs or needle and thread, some of the most peculiar things, even down to the old newspaper that Little Thurn used to come to borrow, and he'd turn away with all the newspapers he could carry and say, "Pay you Sandy."